Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome along to what I'm reliably informed is the 5th Dean's Lecture for 2018. It's fantastic to have you all along with us. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge their ancestors past, present and emerging. Okay, let me get on to this exciting moment that is for me, I think. I was really looking forward to introducing a fellow West Australian tonight in Fiona Stanley, but I did my own little bit of research and realised that you were born in New South Wales, but we'll forgive the first 10 years of your life. As a West Australian, and I think I could speak on behalf of all West Australians that have been around for a few generations, and there's a few of you in the audience tonight. Jane Johnston's another one. Fiona Stanley has been a mainstay in the life of all Western Australians. She's contributed in ways that most people would only dream of, and done more than just work in paediatric health and achieve in her own field. I think she's set standards of great humanity and become such a role model and a leader for people in that state, and nationally and internationally, but more so for Western Australians, and certainly in a state that, you know, perhaps in those days felt quite isolated. Fiona Stanley was the next thing to royalty, I think, in terms of the eyes of West Australians, and so it's a great honour for me, having never met her before I attained this job, to be able to have this position to introduce her to this great audience tonight, and to have the opportunity for us to listen to some of the work that Fiona's contributed to, and current work that she's certainly working on here at MGSE. As many of you would know, she's working alongside Barry McGaw and Mike Silvaris and a host of luminaries on her advisory board on the Australian National Development Index, better known as ANDI, a project that looks for better ways to measure societal progress and to engage citizens in a form of democracy that gives them more opportunity to focus on those priorities and have that expectation of our politicians to be able to deliver a better society that focuses on things that are more than just GDP, and really sort of make sure that we can contribute to that thinking and put the pressure on governments and oppositions at a time when they're perhaps not at their finest, to really think about the things that matter to the general population. So I'll leave that to Fiona to perhaps touch on tonight. Fiona's had a remarkable career in health. She's completed her medical degree at the University of West Australia in 1970, and I'm reliably informed that her first job was at Princess Margaret Hospital as a medical doctor. And I was reading on the net today that she said that part of her work at that hospital was to perform expensive miracles on a number of Indigenous children that were often flown in from remote environments and sort of isolated areas, and the great thing about performing those miracles was that they were able to be sort of attended to and some remedies put in place, but then those children went back to their environment, and many of the same problems that they came into the hospital with returned, and in that lifestyle. So Fiona's work was then in an Aboriginal clinic in East Perth to focus on more of that intervention and support, and then spent time in Aboriginal communities working with young people. And I think that set her off on a life that has sort of been non-stop ever since, to try and make sure that that her focus has been to work on the disabilities and illnesses that are caused in young people, to try and make sure that they can be eradicated, and practices put in place to sustain society in general. She's the founding director of the Telethon Institute for Child Health Research, and she's the current patron. That institute started in 1995, and again brought her to great prominence in Western Australia. The annual telethon that was on prior to 1995 and beyond was a mainstay in Western Australia, and I remember vividly seeing Fiona on those annual events, working to make sure that institute was well supported, and I think everyone in Western Australia felt a part of that. Many great achievements came out of that institute, and I'll leave some of that to Fiona to talk about. Her achievements have been recognised by a number of awards and honours, and if any of you think you have great CVs, I'm not sure that anyone in the room, even collectively, could match this. She was named a Companion of the Order of Australia in 1996, received the Centenary Medal in 2001, was the 2003 Australian of the Year, and named a National Living Treasure by the National Trust in 2004. Her image has also been featured on Australian stamps, and she was an Olympic torchbearer in 2008. Now, if that's not enough, this is a piece de resistance. She was rated the most trusted Australian in 2011. I'm not sure I've ever met the most trusted Australian. And to you can put it in perspective in a minute. And to cap all of that off, in recent times, in 2014, a hospital in Murdoch in Western Australia has been named after her. And added to that, as I also found today, there's at least, I think, Fiona, you've been awarded 6 honorary doctorates from different universities, as I can count, probably more if I was to sort of look further. I could go on forever. I've written so many notes, I could probably give the hour introduction and we wouldn't get to hear Fiona. So without any further ado, can I invite Fiona Stanley to come and speak to us?
I didn't think I was going to have the West Australian fan club here, but that is just such a lovely introduction, Jim. Thank you very much indeed. And half of the people who've mentored me so beautifully are actually in the audience as well. So Barry Jones, thank you for coming. Dick Smallwood, 100 years ago in HMRC, thank you for coming. I saw Bruce Bonyhady come in. Bruce, where are you? Thank you so much for being here, all these wonderful people, and more recently Barry McGaw. So I feel as though I'm very well nurtured here. Frank, you didn't have to come, you know all this stuff inside out, Frank Oberclay. But this is a rather indulgent talk, I think, because it is going to be a bit of a romp, as Field Rickard said. It's going to be a very rapid romp, Field, through why I've ended up in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education working on a project to change the way we measure society. So why would a failed paediatrician who turned down, probably the only person in the world to have turned down the Royal Children's Hospital registrar job and ran off to do other things. So really this is about my personal journey into your school, Jim, and to the Andy Project. And I also would like to acknowledge that we're on the nation of the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, but I only ever like to acknowledge this in relationship to what's happened. And this is what's happened to Aboriginal people whose land we acknowledge, and this is a pathway that is not an Aboriginal pathway. These are not Aboriginal diseases of necessity. They are Aboriginal diseases and outcomes because of the genocide that we've committed. And what's extraordinary is, in spite of this genocide, attempted genocide, it's a story of extraordinary survival by these people. So I want to talk about that perhaps at the end, if we've got time. And so this is the outline of what I want to talk about. From medical school, or from being a doctor, into epidemiology, and then from public health to multidisciplinary research institute, and then from causal pathways to a national agenda for children and youth, and then from a national agenda into changing how we measure societal progress. If we've got time at the end, I would like to finish with my thoughts about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, just because I want to do that at every opportunity that I have to speak. So I'm sorry about that, but that's what we're going to do if we couldn't get through in time. I think we've got about 3 hours, is that right, Jim? Yeah. So good. I've got 265 slides, and oxygen will be delivered if you get low in oxygen. So yes, I did start off as a young doctor and very disturbed about what I was seeing in the Children's Hospital. And as Jim said, we brought these kids in. In fact, one of them, who I'll never forget and really put me on this pathway to public health and prevention, was a child whose name I can't mention, but I remember him very dearly. And he came in 3 times, and each time he came in 15% dehydration from diarrhoea. This is the 1970s we're talking about here. And on one occasion, after the medical miracles that we performed on him, this very thin child, dehydrated child, bouncing, lovely Aboriginal kid, put back in Kundallee, which is out Mount Margaret, beyond Kalgoorlie, into the conditions which caused it in the first place. But in the last admission, he died in my arms. And I thought, there's got to be another way of doing medicine, or I'm out of here. So that was when I turned down the job at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne and went off with my rucksack and discovered, when I hit the UK and then the USA, I discovered epidemiology, data and public health, and all the lights turned on. And they've gone on ever since. Actually, I gave an interview to a journalist once, and I said, a little motor started then and it's never stopped. Anyway, one morning when I was feeling particularly exhausted after writing 18 grants and something or other for that week, I woke up in the morning and Jeff said to me, "How's your little motor this morning, darling?" So that doesn't always go. But so that training in the UK and in the US, where there was no epidemiology in public health really in Australia in the 70s. You had to go overseas to train. And there were all these amazing people who are now my colleagues and friends and mentors too, who were collecting data, setting up registers, all of these things. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to come back to Australia and I want to be the perinatal epidemiologist of Australia. So we came back and set up an NHMRC funded unit, an epidemiology and preventive medicine, first in the country. Amazing, absolutely wonderful. What drove us? What was the environment in which we wanted to do this? Well, it was thalidomide. Do all of you know about thalidomide? It was appalling that we hadn't thought about this. Agent Orange, I was on the Royal Commission in Vietnam to look at the effect of Agent Orange on our servicemen in terms of birth defect. We were incredibly worried because we were resuscitating very preterm babies. Were they going to get cerebral palsy, intellectual disabilities? What was it? They did, but we set up studies of all of these things. So I became very interested, Bruce, in the causes and prevention of the cerebral palsies amongst other disabilities and birth defects. We started to look at these health inequalities, and I think we were probably the first to quantify the gap. We were the first to have Aboriginal data on our data sets because of record linkage. So the Maternal and Child Health Research Database, which we set up, which was a linkage from all antenatal and perinatal information to every single outcome, deaths, hospitalisations, register data on birth defects and everything else. And we could see the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal patterns, and they were very, very clear in stillbirths, neonatal deaths, infant deaths and so on. A gap, a real gap, and that drove, of course, the agenda, as did my early experience with Aboriginal kids and going and visiting communities in Western Australia. That drove that. And we were starting to, starting to look at the importance of these early environments on child development, and they're just the beginnings of increases in adolescent suicides, particularly males. So these were the things that were driving us then. So it was a focus on data, record linkage, getting the team together, but really looking at causal pathways and prevention. What were the things in our kids, in the parents, in the society that was making a difference that we could do something about? So that was about 10 years. Every 10 years I get an itch. And the next 10 years, and this was the end of the 80s now, from public health to a multidisciplinary research institute. And I realised that epidemiology alone was not enough, and that actually had to get the clinicians with clinical research and the basic scientists with their genetic and molecular information. This is pre-genome, guys. This is pre-genome. So it was important that we understood it was both genes and environment that were important in terms of child development, well-being and health. And so what was driving this? All these complex diseases, youth, mental health, asthma, obesity, developmental disorders, child maltreatment, they all had gaps. There were always these social inequalities that occurred in all of these outcomes. So where you were born and your social circumstances dictated your whole life chances. And it still does today, but this was something that we started to identify, and it was really always drove my sense of injustice. And of costs and organisation of services, because people were not thinking about prevention. And this whole idea of causal pathways is very, very hard still to get across, but that was the thing that really got it. The other thing that really made us very successful in the Institute is our engagement with community. Of course, being in a small place like Western Australia, small in terms of population, very large in terms of the geography, meant that we actually had an intimate relationship with the population, as Jim's identified, and that was a real power. And having telethon was a real plus, because you'd go on telethon every year and you'd be able to talk to everyone in Western Australia. 750,000 people watched the close of telethon, and you were able to get your message across about why you were doing the science, why the research was so important, why we wanted to make a difference, why it was important. So research into action, folate and spina bifida, first place in the world to do a preventive program for getting mums to eat more folate and to prevent spina bifida. A whole lot of cross-disciplinary researchers. So if you look at what our philosophy was in those days when it was called the Telethon Research Institute for Child Health. We did actually start off by calling ourselves the West Australian Research Institute for Child Health, Warwich, until I found out it was a Noongar word for something terrible, and we had to change the name of the institute. But then Telethon came on board and we gave them naming rights. So you can see the kinds of things that we were doing here, that we had the population sciences, the basic sciences and the clinical sciences, but working together. And in the late 80s, which is when we conceived this institute, in the early 90s, no one was thinking about cross-disciplinary research. And I remember when Gus Nossel, my wonderful mentor from here, who helped me set up the institute, such generosity, he came to visit us when he was Australian of the Year, and he said, you know, when Fiona told me in 1986 about setting up an institute, I thought she was mad. I thought, oh my gosh, how could he say this? He said, but now, with the genome coming on stream, this institute's got the potential to really take on board the gene-environment interactions, the population data, which made it unique. Or lots of other places have got the genetic research and the clinical research, but we had the population data that made it unique. So that was great. And the other thing that we did, you won't know what kulunga means, but it's Noongar word for child. And what we did was to have a focus on training as many First Nations researchers as we could, because when I went to the Aboriginal community, I said, we're a research institute, we're not a service provider, what do you want us to be for you? And they said, we want you to be our mother. What does a mother do? She gives all the information, the love, the care, the knowledge and the funding to her children to cope in a very difficult world and never lets them go too far without keeping an eye on them if they want to be kept. And that's what we've done. We've trained 18 postdocs, Aboriginal postdocs, who are now, a lot of them still in West Australia, but one of them's here, Professor Sandra Eads, just appointed at Melbourne University this year, Professor of Public Health. She was brought up on the reserve at Mount Barker. So, great success story. So we wanted to be the best institute to train Aboriginal researchers, and we got there. So we were interested in life course stuff and data as advocacy, and that made a huge difference. So what then we decided was, and this was where Frank joined the team, we wanted to have a national agenda for children and young people. And I guess what influenced our agenda then was this increases not just in health problems in children and developmental disorders and those sorts of things, but all these problems that were happening in educational issues, in disabilities, behaviours, detentions. And so the decrease in human capability that was happening because of that, the increasing costs of services in health, mental health, remedial education. Everything was as the ends of pathways, huge investment, not sort of asking the question, why is this happening in our society? And so this investment in prevention wasn't happening. And of course, what was happening also was the international research showing us that early childhood had a huge impact on the life course. So ARACI was born, the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. We had researchers, policymakers and practitioners all together across a whole range of disciplines. Anyone interested in the health and wellbeing of children and young people, we wanted to recruit into this organisation. And it became a strong advocate for children. We got up the longitudinal study of Australian children. We got up then eventually after that, the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. We got the Australian Early Development Index, now census, which came out of Frank's area as well. And it was a whole of society approach to improve children and young people. So we had people from, paediatricians and health people to psychologists, criminologists, people interested in healthy cities, architects, lawyers, criminologists. It was fantastic. Town planners, it was fantastic. So one of the things that was very helpful was that actually I was on the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council for something like from 1995 till about 2008. And that meant that I was able to participate in this amazing cabinet discussions about what should happen with Australian science, and it was just fantastic. So this is how we sold early childhood to John Howard. So this is actually my PMSEC slide, which actually got early childhood up. A lot of other people were also lobbying. So what it was converting children into economic benefits to the society. It's okay, it's all true. It's just that it's put in a different kind of possibility. So all these children commencing their lives were in environments which enabled full opportunities for healthy child development. So most children are mentally, physically healthy, reaching their educational social potential. and participating to their full potential, and there you have an intellectually competent and emotionally capable workforce in a world that requires good technical skills. National economic prosperity, sir, yes. And of course, this is hardly ever counted, but you're not draining those budgets with all of the ends of pathways and so on. And of course, the next generation is socially, emotionally competent, cycles of economic prosperity. And he really believed in it, and he funded early childhood. And of course, it continued with the next government. So that was, I thought that was a bit of fun, but it's also all true, of course. So the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth is going well today. The thing that I think, and this was in the 2000s now we're talking, it didn't take over another organisation. What was great about ARACI is that it's an organisation of organisations. So what it did was empower a lot of organisations to work collectively for children and young people. And I think that's really, really very good, and to make them more effective. So, what is a civil society for children? What does it look like? And this is an old slide that I used in the sort of mid to late 90s to explain why we wanted to have this, if you like, a children's agenda, but then why I would go on then to want to measure societal progress. And so it's the sort of the old Bronfenbrenner slide, but this is what we concentrated on in the early years. I was interested in children and the risk factors around them and these, but the real things that are influencing, abling or disabling this child in its family and community are these things in the outside. And you can try very hard in here, but if you've got these kinds of social, economic, cultural, political, workplace, can I say even spiritual things which are going against you, then it's really hard. And if all these things are very positive. So if you look at this civil society compared with the uncivil society, this is a focus on equality and diversity compared with inequalities. Just think about where Australia is today. Trust and care compared with fear and violence, and what's happening perhaps in America too. Collective good compared with greed. Valuing parents compared with not. Valuing childhoods instead of fast-tracking them and commodifying them and selling bras to 8-year-olds or whatever else we're doing. Prevention, this is my big thing, and not just with health, but across. I mean, you think if we'd sort of diagnose climate change properly, and we'd be into preventing rather than having to now cope. Protected environments instead of degrading it. Safe places for all except for the few. Effective use of helpful technologies except the damaging, etc., etc. So this is sort of the kind of thinking that drove me into how we measure societal progress. So, So this is my now move into why I've become so passionate about Andy and measuring societal progress. So if you look at Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, Nicholas Stern was also part of this, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi, mismeasuring our lives, why GDP doesn't add up. Now these are Nobel laureate economists who've seen the light, and the kind of comments that are being made. This is in fact the OECD, the 2010 meeting, why GDP is not a good measure of societal progress. It counts all economic activities as positive. Excuse me. It includes activities that reduce well-being. If you sell more guns, tobacco, military weapons and pollutants, your GDP goes up. It ignores the unpaid domestic work, non-market production, and ignores all the key factors of well-being, health, education, working conditions, equity, time use, etc., etc. It ignores factors essential to sustain well-being, the stock of environmental, human and social capital. And a really good example from Victoria is, and this is from Mike Salvaris, who's our fearless leader in Andy, this was the Victorian bushfires in 2009, 4 billion boost to progress, and it came from these sorts of things. Huge number of people died, including people in education that Frank and I knew, and because of all these expenditures. So GDP is not our best measure of societal progress. It is a singular measure that is absolutely up there in every country. So if we have this singular measure, singular focus on GDP, What happens? Well, really, we've seen increasing inequalities because the focus has been on wealth creation, and that's not just in wealth but in power. We've got overconsumption and unsustainable growth, and I put into this things like climate change. I wish in a way we hadn't called it climate change. I wish we'd call it overpopulation, overconsumption, etc., because it's part of an outcome rather than a cause, although it's a cause of lots of problems. Waste, environmental degradation, unlivable cities and pollution. Individualism and competitiveness, reducing altruism and caring communities. The push for short-term profits. The excessive influence of big business, and including the media, on political decision-making. We've seen this not just in the direct past, but over this last years, and the concentration of political power and the weakening of democracy. And this is of international concern. And what got me excited about Andy was that we were part of an international OECD project, much broader than the social determinants of health, which I'd been working in all my life. And it sort of struck me, this is the Modernity's Paradox, that we've concentrated so much on the wealth, growing wealth, and countries like Australia who have grown their GDP so spectacularly, and yet we're seeing these rises in all the problems in our families, our communities, our children, our young people. Modernity's Paradox was coined by one of our heroes, Clyde Hertzman. And what keeps on coming back to me is this incredible lack of appreciation of the cause and power of prevention. And it seems to me extraordinary that we can be so stupid. So we are mismeasuring progress, and this is the UNDP. We now must think about a legitimate way of which has to be people-centred, equitably distributed, and environmentally and socially sustainable. So I seem to have got the wrong... Oh no, here we go. So we have a long-term community research collaboration, which is the Andy project. It's aimed at a national model of progress from increasing economic production to increasing equitable and sustainable wellbeing by promoting a community debate on progress and our shared vision for Australia, and I want to go into that quite a bit, and developing a new research and community-based system of national measures of wellbeing and sustainability to show our progress towards these goals. So, you know, you think about the Sustainable Development Goals as well, and how that's now... We could have ignored the Millennium Development Goals because they were sort of, you know, lower middle income kind of goals. But the Sustainable Development Goals we can't ignore. And Andy's very much like that. We want to have those kind of goals which are about this sustainability, this well-being. So we can ask ourselves 8 questions as a nation. Are we better or worse off than our parents? And that's a big debate at the moment, isn't it? Because, you know, we are in some ways, and yet there may be. Are our communities safer and stronger? Are we healthier and wiser? Are our jobs and livelihoods more secure? Are our air and water cleaner? Are our natural resources healthier? Are we fairer? Are we leaving a better Australia for our children? So in some situations you might say yes, and some you might say, well, actually, no. So I think they're good questions to ask. So we believe, and Andy, and this is Mike Salvaris' real passion, is that this is a democratic issue. And of course, we'll talk about democracy too. A society that defines its goals and key progress measures directly affects the life of its citizens. And a healthy democracy improves progress and wellbeing generally and is itself a key element of society's project. So it's going to be one of our measures. How we're going to measure that is going to be very challenging. But citizens need good information to make good democratic decisions. The only reason I ever wanted to go on the ABC board, which you didn't mention, Jim, but that's quite okay, was because I wanted to get good information. I mean, the ABC is it. I feel a bit like a walking advocate. Here I've got the ABC thing, I've got the Aboriginal beads, you know, so I've got climate change written all over me. So, yeah, there we go. So I think that's really important, that the good information, and we're not getting that, and the ABC is it, because the rest of our media are not able to give us that proper information very clearly. Good measures make for more transparent and accountable government, and engaging citizens in the task of defining and measuring progress strengthen their democratic capacity. And as we go through this, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the other international countries that have actually done this, and think, you know, you might think this is a dream that I'm talking about here, and it's far too aspirational. Other countries are doing it. You know, so this is very, very very exciting. So if we think about our democracy, and we did this slide several months ago before all this kerfuffle happened in Canberra, so low and declining public trust in government. Well, I mean, it's probably gone, I don't know. But anyway, I mean, I can't laugh about the fact that Aboriginal people asked for a voice and they got Tony Abbott, but it is funny, isn't it? It is awfully, awfully, horribly funny. Anyway, decline in voting rate, falling participation in political parties, growth in corporate and privatised, which is much less accountable, government, increase in corrupt influence, and you think of all of the ways that that's happening again and again and again. I'm just not surprised now when I see another article about somebody who's corrupt. I mean, it's almost sort of normal practice. Growing inequality in wealth and opportunity, I've mentioned that, the weakening of civil rights and privacy, declining citizenship education in schools. I think that's something that you're probably aware of, Jim. The declining youth support for democracy and declining youth voter involvement. You know that before the plebiscite, same-sex marriage plebiscite, which is the only good thing to come out of that, except we got it up, I thought it was an absolute waste of money. $121 million could have been spent on Aboriginal controlled early childhood services, but there you are. What came out of that was young people enrolled. Because there are 1 million young Australians under the age of 30 who were not on the electoral roll because they don't really think that democracy, as we have it in Australia, the political process, is helpful. 1 million. I mean, what a difference that would make. But they enrolled to vote for same-sex marriage, and so they're on the roll, which is really good. So this is a global movement. This is really exciting. You can't see any of this. I'm terribly sorry. It's all too small, but it's just because so many countries are involved in this. So the ones that, I mean, you can see in every continent there are several that are doing this. You know, there's not just a happiness index in Bhutan, there's one in Germany. But so the countries that have done really well on this are Canada, the Canadian Institute of Wellbeing, I'm talking about that. Everyone's heard of Bhutan's happiness index, and it's really very interesting to observe how that is being played out and influencing what happens to their society. Italy has got you might think Italy's got governments which are pretty dysfunctional, but let me tell you that Italy now, with something like 80 universities around the nation, are working for a sustainable Italy, and this is embedded in government. And and of course Bhutan's is embedded in government. It's actually part of their government. I'm going to talk about Wales in a minute, but Wales is, I think, our brilliant example. I know it's a small country. But New Zealand, what Jacinda Ardern is doing, is now saying, I want to measure wellbeing. GDP is not going to guide my government's budget. Wellbeing and how the people are doing and what's happening to children and health and education. So the reason why Mike Salvaris and Kate Lysett, and who's our wonderful postdoc researcher on the Andy Project, the reason they're not here is because they're in New Zealand at a Measuring Wellbeing and Policy conference. And they're going to be talking to that. And it's very, very exciting what's happening in New Zealand. So if we get really down, we can all migrate across to, or perhaps get her to come across here. That would be very good. Okay, so once and the OECD every 3 or 4 years holds a forum on statistics, knowledge and progress to debate what's happening in these countries and the progress. And we all meet in places like Istanbul and South Korea this year and so on. And we go and talk about the difficulties of having a conversation with a large proportion of the community, how you get people to say what they value, and then how we get measures around that. And that's the challenge for us. And then once we've got those measures, how do we influence? If it's not embedded in government, what do we do? So these are the issues that we're grappling with. But so these are the summary issues that have come out of the international global movement. GDP is a very poor a measure of societal progress. Societies must develop holistic measures of their progress, which includes the economy, but includes society, culture, environment, and governance. New measures should include qualitative and not just quantitative dimensions of progress, subjective wellbeing, like the happiness index, like other things about how young people feel about being in Australia and what do they feel about their future. So those kinds of polls are happening. Community belonging, increasingly that's being measured. There's some terrific surveys about that. Relationships, life satisfaction. The problem we're facing is not just the wrong measures, but the wrong model of societal progress. And, you know, this increases in economic production, which you hear all the time. You know, how can we have increased growth going on forever? It's just not sustainable. Increases in equitable and sustainable well-being are the way that we believe that we should be going forward. So the task of developing this new progress paradigm and new measures is a political and democratic issue, and all of the countries realise this as much as a technical issue. And the engagement of citizens and communities working with academics and policymakers, that's happening in every country. So the way that this is being done within the OECD countries is to team up with academics. Hence our delight, Jim, that you took us into your school and said, yes, this has got to, well, thank you, Field, actually. I should bow, because you did it first and then he had to cope with us afterwards. Yeah, that's good. I remember now. Yep. So very, very important to realise that this is, again, a wonderful collaboration between the community, academics and researchers, and the people who are going to put it into practice, the policymakers. So it's really a very exciting thing. Now, Australia was incredibly important in the OECD. This is measuring Australia's progress from ABS. And this was actually fantastic. We were one of the leading countries. These are all the domains. Look at all these domains: society, economy, governance, environment. Look at all these fabulous things: community connections and diversity, learning and knowledge, close relationships, sustaining the environment, all these wonderful things. It got defunded, of course. So now ABS hasn't got a project mapping Australia's progress. So thank goodness we have Andy. So you might like to know that Treasury used to have, in that federal treasury, the well-being of the population as its first priority. But you don't need that anymore. That's gone too. As long as we've got a good GDP, everything else will be fine. So that's gone. You know, you just feel they don't get it. They don't understand causal pathways. So this is our Andy project, sort of. We're not absolutely sure about all of this, but I hope you can read. I'll just quickly go around the corner, go around the circle. So up here is life satisfaction, children and young people's wellbeing, I'll come back to that, community and regional life, culture, recreation and leisure, governance and democracy, economic prosperity, education, knowledge and creativity, that's Barry's domain, he's leading that, sustainability and environment, justice, fairness and human rights, health, I'm leading that domain, Indigenous wellbeing, work and life balance. Now, when you think about children and young people and First Nations people, everything applies to them, doesn't it? So how do you have a separate index for them, or do you have a separate index for them, and you know, what do you do? So there are those sorts of questions. And now what's so exciting about First Nations and Indigenous wellbeing is there's an Indigenous data sovereignty movement that's not just in Australia, it's international. And Aboriginal people are now saying, give us control of our data. And by the way, we're good analytically and we can do it. And so there are this marvellous, I felt amazed. I went to this fabulous meeting at UniMelb in October last year, and I pride myself on knowing about Aboriginal data sets and Aboriginal data and things. I hadn't heard of Aboriginal, this Indigenous data sovereignty movement. The examples were fantastic. Give Aboriginal people control of their data in small communities, going right up to what's collected by ABS and AHW, and things change, because they're the ones measuring their wellbeing, they're the ones saying what should happen, and they're the ones influencing policy. It's fantastic. And that fueled my commitment to commenting about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where they asked for a voice, give Aboriginal people a voice, and that will happen. So we have to think about whether, in fact, we say to a group of Aboriginal people, and I've already started this conversation, what about you doing your own Andy? And they're really hot to trot on that. So that could be really good, because usually we do it all for everyone and then we think of Aboriginal people later, you know. So they could actually start leading this part of Andy, and we could see how that would work. So, so the key features of Andy, that it's a civil society collaborative initiative, it's long-term, very important that we do that community conversation really well, and we can use all of the different ways to do that. That we'll report a progress index in these wellbeing domains. Perhaps we'll do it every month on the different domains, and it's got to have this community engagement and ownership. We've got a fabulous relationship with ABS. Dennis True, in the form of Chief Statistician, is the chair of our advisory council. We've got fabulous external partners. I'm going to add New Zealand onto here now, because they're over there, and Wales, they're over there recruiting New Zealand into our network, which we're going to run an international network of research. Very strong collaborative research base, not just the University of Melbourne, the Australian Council of Learned Academies, who've done a great report for us, other universities coming on board as well. It's going to be a network, resource and clearinghouse. It's going to have education and communication emphasis. And we're going to go for non-government funding because we want to influence government, I guess, and have a fund reliance. So that's already started to happen. And so we're in a pilot phase. We've been going for nearly 18 months in this pilot phase, and you can see what's happening here. We've got these core values, which are again the SDG, United Nations Conventions of Social Progress, and what we've done with our early career researchers have reviewed all of the indices around the world, what's in them, how do they work, what was the process of selecting them, how much community engagement was there, etc., etc. And then we've gone to our domain advisory groups who've been amazing and given us so much of their wisdom. It includes a lot of people from the community as well as our policy and academic people. We've had people come down from Canberra to be on our health one, which has been fantastic. And then we go to our community focus groups and out to the community and poll about what they think is important for Australia, and we've got that information. I can show you a bit of that. And then we go back to the domain advisory groups, and this is where we're at the moment with the two domains of health and education. So we've made lots of mistakes and we've got lots of thinking, and we're in touch with international people. Lucky we've got the OECD forum coming up in November, and we'll be able to sort of check our progress against the others, and then we're going to have our pilot report by the end of the year. Bullseye, we hope. But anyway, so that's a process that we're going through at the moment, and I think doing a pilot means that you make all the mistakes so you can improve it when you're actually doing the main thing. So these are just the results. We were really chuffed by this because we went to a large-ish sample of Australian adults who weren't disabled, I have to say, Bruce, so that we need to think about how we engage when we do our proper surveys of how we engage people with disabilities and their carers. But look at this, 87% agree that to measure national progress, health, social and environmental statistics as important as economic statistics. So that's a vast majority of people. Actually, what amazed me about all of this, I have to move over here, was just how highly ranked the things that we thought that people should value are valued. But this has come out of every country's polling. So it's not, the UNDP, 70 million people in the UNDP survey, they came out with a similar sort of thing. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised. We just think Australia's in such an awful place at the moment that people are just so greedy and horrible. And they're not. They're terrific. So these are, you're ranking out of 10 here for all of our areas, our domain areas for Andy. You probably can't see this, guys, but they're high. Children and youth wellbeing came out top. But look, Indigenous wellbeing, I thought was going to be like 3. So, that's 7.45. That's fantastic. I thought we were more racist than that. I'm so pleased we're not, but, I'm just so pleased. And would you like to be in a community engagement, a national community engagement program? 76% said, yep, I'll be in. So that's fantastic. So if you look at Canada, I'll really speed up now because I know I'm going over time, wherever the clock is. I've probably broken that already. Anyway, yeah, well, I think I removed the clock so that we could go on for the 3 hours. So this was what Canada did in terms of its community engagement. Look at the length of time it's taken them. And they took all this time in the various different ways that these are different community engagement projects that they did. And what kind of Canada do we want? That's the sort of question that Wales has asked and so on. And so they got a national consultation and they now developed their Canadian Index of Wellbeing, and this is what it looks like. This is a very sort of what they call an overly rosy view as how well Canadians are doing, and here's the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. What's so good about the Canadian Index of Wellbeing is what we want with Andy is that we're able to drill down and say, well, in what particular ways aren't we doing so well? And so these are all the different ways. So there's GDP, living standards have sort of gone up and down and around, community vitality here, democratic engagement's quite good, education's quite good. This is the whole overarching index, so that's all of these things joined together. But you can say, well, look, environment and time use and things like leisure and culture, we're not doing very well. And this is not good for us. So you can actually say, now, what we also want to do, and they do in Canada, but I haven't seen the data as well, is that we'll be able to do this by subpopulations, First Nations, age groups, genders, geographic areas, all these things that we can do with the Australian Early Development Census, for example. You can say, well, hang on, overall we might be doing okay, but let's look at these subpopulations and where people are living, and perhaps that's not doing so well. So the exciting thing about this is that local governments, local councils might want to do Andes. It was terribly disappointing that Jay Weatherill got voted out from South Australia. I'm not saying a political allegiance, but he'd agreed to do Andy for the whole of South Australia. So we would have had an Andy project for a whole state. They're measuring wellbeing really well in South Australia, and we thought that would be great. So that was a shame. So are we going to have a major national conversations with 500,000 Australians? How are we going to do that? We're piloting that. And I think, you know, the more I think about Andy, I think we'll get measures. I think we will get measures that reflect what people think, because other countries have done it, and we're getting there with our measures in our pilot. But this is really important. I think this is really important, that we actually start to engage Australians and say, you know, what do you want for your future? You have power. You could influence what we measure, and that might influence the kind of decisions that our politicians are making. But if we do that in local councils, for example, people will see that you can. It's a bit like Trump in America, you know, where the states are saying, well, bugger it, we're going to go on with our agendas. You know, and my brother lives in New York and my sister lives in Michigan with their family. My brother's never been an activist. He just hasn't got those genes. I mean, I don't know where they went with him. He's just a bloody good scientist. But he's joined organisations, he's funding, he's marching in the streets, he's become quite outrageous. It's wonderful. So you know, I think that's the kind of thing that you will look at ways in which these data can be used to make a difference, because my belief still is that data are powerful and data are important, and that's what we need to do. So I want to now talk about Wales, because Wales is in a way a great model. And they've done a wonderful project called What Kind of Wales Do We Want? And this is the kind of answers they got from asking people in Wales. A globally responsible Wales, a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, and of course, being Welsh, they want the language. I'm amazed in here that they haven't got We Want to Sing more, but that's part probably of the thriving Welsh language and culture. So isn't that an interesting group of values, very similar to the ones we have? But what I like particularly about Wales is a globally responsible Wales. It's a little country, but there you are. Now, they've embedded it in government. This is a government initiative, like New Zealand. So they have a Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. They have a response to that future generation. They have research, they have public service boards, they have future trends, integration involved. All these things are actually embedded in government. You have to report every service, health, education, welfare services, environment, industry, have to report to this commissioner as to how they're implementing their well-being strategies. I feel weak at the knees. Anyway, so isn't it a great model? So if we haven't got it embedded in government, and we're a long way from that, what do we do? Well, there's got to be ways. In the middle of the night, I think, oh, what are we going to do? But I think we will be able to use the data, as I said, in smaller communities, and that might be the way to go. So, Andy, a way to build a practical shared vision for a fairer, more sustainable society with greater wellbeing for all, an important tool that will increase transparency and clarity in policy making, planning and nation building, and a way to re-engage citizens and strengthen democracy, transparency and confidence in the political process. So that's really why I've come to it. I mean, I've come from this sort of little research, very interested in children and their, you know, what that might be the preventive strategies, into this big societal project, because I know that if we have something like this, our kids will be better off. Our kids will be better off. So I just want to say that this is for academics. We're in an academic institution tonight. It's a Dean's lecture, etc., etc. This isn't just about, you know, airy-fairy stuff in the community, you might say. It is actually, this is the Australian Council of Learned Academies in 2013. This is an important opportunity, a duty for academic and scientific community to work with policymakers, stakeholders, and the broader citizenry. I mean, this is why we do stuff, isn't it? Isn't this why we do academic stuff, that we want to actually make a better world and make our research make a difference? And this is the quote I love: the creation of a National Progress Index for Australia could become one of the most significant collaborative undertakings of Australian science and research in the second decade of the 21st century. Yes. Okay. So I just want to acknowledge, before I go into the Uluru Statement, have I got time? I won't be long. I want to acknowledge Mike Salvaris and Barry McGaw and Kate Lysett and Matthew Courtney and Ghazaleh Dashti, who are our three outstanding mid-career researchers. And I want to also acknowledge Claudia Sandoval, who's up here in the audience. You are wonderful. I don't know how you make the budget go where it is. And Jacques Deveau-Malin, who's our Andy person who runs our Andy company. And This is a wonderful cartoon that I just discovered. If you can't read it, it's the Climate Summit. And he's saying, energy independence, preserve rainforests, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean air, water, healthy children. And he's saying, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Dreadful, isn't it? Anyway, okay. So, Jim, two minutes at the end on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Okay. Why this agenda? Why am I interested in this agenda? Well, it's a history of marginalisation and genocide, as I put in my first slide, about that colonisation pathway. Ongoing racism, discrimination and marginalisation, ineffective top-down services which waste a huge amount of money, and who gets blamed for that? Oh, Aboriginal people, of course. They don't like our services, they won't come to them, it's not right. You know, we offer all this stuff and lack of input and control by First Nations people. They set up a Dondale Royal Commission, 50 million like that, at the same time as they were defunding the Aboriginal-controlled early childhood services for the nation. The very causal pathways that would stop kids getting into Dondale. I couldn't believe that. We've been lobbying so intensively for that Aboriginal early childhood agenda. I can't believe that in 2018 we still are. It's just not right. Anyway, and the inadequate acknowledgement of history. You know, absolutely. So, this wonderful statement, I almost weep when I see this. Now, if you go into the referendum council and read the dialogue process, just go into the council, the referendum council, the dialogues for 12 months, set off by Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten to say, go and speak to the people and find out what you want in terms of the constitutional changes and so on and so forth. But that referendum council report, you put the context of this statement into that. It's really important to do that. Anyway, so out comes this wonderful statement, which asks for a voice, to talk about treaty negotiations, and then to acknowledge history, a reconciliation of our history. Three things. It is a weak as dishwater statement. It's not going to threaten anybody. It's not asking for a third chamber of parliament that's undemocratic because only Aboriginal people can vote for it. It's a beautiful statement. And it is, I'm not going to read the whole statement, it would take too long, but it is really a beautiful statement. You know, if you want to do something to support First Nations, there are two immediate things you can do. One is that you can sign the statement that I wrote in response to Malcolm Turnbull rejecting this statement without even ringing any of the people who signed this document. It just leaked a press release from the PM&C saying the reason why they weren't going to support it. No one rang up and said to Pat Anderson or to Megan Davis or to anyone that, you know, this is the reason why. I can't believe this. And you can support firstnations.com.au, that's the statement I wrote, and I think there are about 20,000 signatures now without any publicity. Or there is a new process now. I mean, everyone was so gutted to start with that they went off into the wilderness, I guess, and I think there were probably some people with significant mental illness as a result of it, actually. But there is now a new website we're setting up. I'm part of a process, and it's going to be called Uluru for All. And I want to just finish with the most wonderful quote from Garaway Yunupingu. And this, to me, says it all, and that's why you should sign up to these things and support, write to your MPs and write to Tony Abbott, I guess. And this is what Garaway said in the Referendum Council document it was read at Uluru. He couldn't get to Uluru, but it was read at Uluru. What Aboriginal people ask is that the modern world now makes the sacrifices necessary to give us a real future, to relax its grip on us, to let us breathe, to let us be free of the determined control exerted on us to make us like you. And you should take that a step further and recognise us for who we are and not who you want us to be. Let us be who we are, Aboriginal people in a modern world, and be proud of us. Acknowledge that we have survived the worst that the past has thrown at us, and we are here with our songs, our ceremonies, our land, our language, our people, our full identity. What a gift is that we can give you if you choose to accept us in a meaningful way. Thank you.
you.